The Galactic Academy's Xenobiology lecture hall hummed with the soft chittering of 100 different species. Professor Velkoth, a graceful Cherulian with bioluminescent skin, gestured at the holographic display showing various planetary ecosystems. Nancy Martinez sat in the back row, her human frame hunched over a standard issue datapad, trying to make herself as small as possible. It had been 3 months since humanity had joined the Galactic Coalition, and Nancy was among the first wave of human students admitted to the prestigious academy on Centris Prime. She'd learned quickly that being from a class 12 Deathworld made her an object of equal parts fascination and fear among her classmates. Next to her sat Parker Chen, the only other human in the xenobiology program. He seemed to handle the attention better than Nancy, always ready with a disarming smile. When the Vexerie students skittered away from him in the cafeteria, or when the gentle Lumine gave their seats a wide berth, "Pay attention," Parker whispered, noticing Nancy's distant expression. "Velkoth is covering the Andromeda sector ecosystems. This'll be on the exam." Nancy nodded, refocusing on the lecture. The professor was explaining how most sentient species evolved on Class 3 through Class 7 worlds, planets with mild gravitational pulls, filtered atmospheres, and predictable weather patterns. Earth, by contrast, was a nightmare world of crushing gravity, corrosive oxygen, extreme temperature variations, and an ecosystem where everything either wanted to eat you or poison you. A Plythar student in the front row raised a tentacle. "Professor, is it true that Deathworlders can break our bones just by grabbing us?" Nancy felt her cheeks burn. These questions came up at least once a week. Professor Velkoth's lights flickered in what Nancy had learned was embarrassment. While it's true that humans possess significantly greater physical strength due to their planet's gravity, they are quite capable of. The rest of the sentence was cut off by a sound that made every student freeze. Whoop, whoop, whoop. The invasion klaxon. Red emergency lights bathed the lecture hall as the professor's voice took on a trembling urgency. "Everyone, please proceed calmly to the designated shelter zones. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not." The building shuddered. Through the massive viewport that made up the western wall, Nancy saw them, Creshtar warships, dozens of them, descending through Centris Prime's atmosphere like dark meteors. The insectoid Creshtar had been the Coalition's enemies for decades, but they'd never struck this deep into Coalition space. Panic erupted. Students of 100 species scrambled for the exits, creating a bottleneck of chitin, scales, and tentacles. The Lumine were producing fear pheromones that made the situation worse. A Vexerie student got trampled, their crystalline limbs cracking against the floor. Nancy's hands gripped her desk. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to move, to do something. But she'd been so careful for months, so controlled, terrified of hurting someone by accident. Parker grabbed her shoulder. "Nancy, we need to. Another impact. Closer this time." The viewport cracked, and Nancy saw a Creshtar drop pod slam into the plaza below. Armored warriors began pouring out, their plasma weapons cutting down Coalition security forces. One of the warriors raised its weapon toward the lecture hall. That time seemed to slow. Nancy saw the energy buildup in the plasma cannon. She saw Professor Velkoth still trying to direct students to safety. She saw the Plythar student frozen in fear near the window. Something inside her snapped, not in panic, but with crystal clarity. Her hands drove down, and the reinforced polymer desk split in half like cardboard. Nancy was moving before she consciously decided to move, her Deathworld muscles finally unleashed. She covered the distance to the Plythar student in 3 strides. That would have looked comically impossible to her classmates if they'd had time to notice. She grabbed the student carefully, always carefully, even now in Dove. The plasma bolt hit where they'd been standing, superheating the air and blasting a hole through the viewport. Wind screamed into the lecture hall. "Parker," Nancy shouted over the chaos, "get everyone to the back stairwell." Now, Parker didn't question. He began herding students, his voice cutting through the panic with surprising authority. "You heard her. Move, move, move." Nancy set the Plythar student down and turned toward the shattered viewport. Another Creshtar warrior was climbing through, its mandibles clicking with predatory anticipation. Every coalition species evolved from prey animals or peaceful herbivores. They developed technology out of necessity, cooperation out of survival. Humans evolved alongside apex predators. Sometimes they'd been the apex predators. The Kreshtar warrior looked at Nancy. For the first time in 3 months, she didn't try to hide what she was. She didn't slouch or soften her stance or apologize for existing. She stood at her full height, 1.7 meters of evolved Deathworld survivor, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. The Kreshtar hesitated its first mistake. Nancy moved. Her fist caught it in what she hoped was its center of mass. The warrior flew backward through the viewport, its armor cracking from the impact of a blow delivered by a creature built for 1 g of gravity. 2 more warriors climbed through. Nancy grabbed a piece of her broken desk, the desk that was supposed to withstand any normal student's strength, and wielded it like a club. Behind her, she heard Parker getting the last students out. "Nancy, come on, go. I'm right behind you." She wasn't, but Parker was smart enough to know when to follow orders. Nancy faced the warriors. They raised their weapons, but she was already moving, using the desk fragment as a shield, closing distance faster than they expected. On their homeworld, prey didn't charge. She fought like her ancestors fought, without rules, without mercy, with the desperate creativity of a species that had clawed its way to the top of Earth's food chain. When Coalition security finally breached the lecture hall 5 minutes later, they found Nancy standing among 3 unconscious Kreshtar warriors, breathing hard, bleeding from a dozen cuts, still holding a piece of her desk. Parker pushed through the security team and grabbed her. "You insane Deathworlder. You beautiful, insane language," Nancy said, then laughed, slightly hysterical. "Is everyone okay?" "Because of you," Professor Velkoth said, approaching carefully. Their bioluminescence flickered with something Nancy couldn't quite read. "You saved us." Nancy looked at her shaking hands, at the broken desk, at the fear and awe in her professor's eyes. "I'm sorry I broke Academy property," she said quietly. Professor Velkoth's lights flashed in what Nancy had learned was laughter. "I think," the professor said, "we can make an exception, though perhaps we should requisition stronger desks for the human students." As Coalition forces secured the building and medical teams arrived, Nancy sat against the wall next to Parker. The invasion was being repelled. Across the planet, the Kreshtar had underestimated Coalition defenses. They definitely underestimated the Deathworlders. "You know, everyone's going to talk about this," Parker said. Nancy groaned. "Great, more attention. Maybe different attention, though," he suggested. "Less scary monster and more scary monster who's on our side." Nancy looked at her classmates. The Blythe, our student she'd saved, was watching her with something like wonder instead of fear. Others were looking at her differently too. She'd spent 3 months trying to be small, trying to fit in. Maybe it was time to accept what she was, a human, a Deathworlder, a survivor. And on that day, when the invasion alarm sounded and Nancy Martinez split her desk in half, the Galactic Academy learned what humanity had always known sometimes. The quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. Not despite being from a death world. Because of it, and